Welcome back, everyone. I have been doing an extensive amount of research to learn about today's poet. His name is Leopold Sedar Senghor, and he is a Frenchman. And so my pronunciation is probably lacking the proper accent. But if you were to click this YouTube video, if I were to click it, you could not hear it. But if you were to do it on your own, you would get the proper pronunciation. There's another really great video. It's super short. If I were to play it again, you wouldn't be able to hear it, but I've listened to it several times. The narrator has a very heavy African accent, so I really had to listen closely, but I learned a lot from this video. Leopold Sedar Senghor, and I'm going to summarize some things for you here. Okay, he was a poet, a politician, and an intellectual. He was very successful at all three of these. So you'll see that I took a picture on the right here. This is Africa, okay, and I Google mapped it. So he was born in 1906 in Senegal to a peanut merchant, and he later became a scholar. Okay, so he went from living in this little tribe in West Africa to being this really renowned scholar, and even later he becomes president. And I'm going to explain that in the next slide or the next two slides. But I love what the narrator said of him. He said that this um, journey of his made him a symbol of the African shift from colonial domination to self-determination. And even Wikipedia, which isn't a great source, but it has named him as one of the most influential African figures of the 20th century. So I thought that that was really fascinating and inspiring. He also starts this cultural movement to raise Black consciousness before World War II called negritude. Okay, so I'm not going to go into much detail about that, but it eventually leads to the independence of the Senegalese people, which is really fascinating. So I have a little anecdote here. Okay, early in World War II, he was a French soldier and he was captured by the Nazis. He and fellow prisoners of African descent were made to line up against a wall, and as the Nazis prepared to shoot them, Senghor shouted, "Long live France, long live Black Africa." Before these shots were fired, a white French prisoner intervened, and Senghor and the others were allowed to live because of his bravery here. Okay, this incident highlights Senghor's dual identity as both an African and a Frenchman, right? So not only is he brave, but he's like super proud of his heritage and his culture. Okay, so Senghor, as I just explained, he grew up in Senegal, which at that time was part of French West Africa. Okay, so in other words, France owned it. Um, and since he was an exceptional student, he earned a scholarship to study in France. However, after graduating from a college in Paris, he taught in French school after World War II, and he eventually became involved in an African movement for independence, which I talked a little bit about, negritude, right? Under his leadership, Senegal gained nationhood in 1960. So that's pretty impressive. So they became independent as a result of everything he worked for. And what's even more impressive is Senghor served as Senegal's president for 20 years until he retired in 1980. Senghor began writing poetry as a student in Paris. Writing gave him an outlet for exploring his identity as an African immersed in French culture, and later for exploring uniqueness for his own Senegalese culture. Songs for Signare, which is what we're going to read today, or actually we're only going to read a little passage from it. It was originally written in French, and we are going to read the translated version. So just to talk a little bit more here about Senghor and African culture, he often wrote of his beloved homeland, Senegal. In fact, he was interested in all of Africa, so he didn't just focus on his homeland. In his poem, he refers to masks, which play an important role in many different African cultures. He also mentions ritual stools, which were at the seats of kings and other important people. The weaving of mats and cloth is also a revered art throughout all of Africa, and that is referenced as well. Okay. One more thing of interest here is that He wrote songs for Signare to be read and sung to the accompaniment of the kalam, a four-stringed African lute. So I put a picture here. This is what the kalam looks like. And I listened to a couple of YouTube videos. It's a really cool instrument. If I were to click this and play it, however, you would not hear it. So you're going to have to YouTube it if you're interested. But moving forward, you might be asking, if we're studying American literature, right? Why are we studying this French guy? Okay. Well, when he was a student in Paris in the 1920s, at the very start of the Harlem Renaissance, he was introduced to all of these writers that were emerging from Harlem. He was so impressed by their works that even though he knew very little English, he learned some of the Harlem Renaissance poems by heart. Okay, this is a really intelligent man, really smart guy. I'm kind of, I'm like embarrassed thinking about, what my life will amount to in comparison to all that this guy has done. He's pretty impressive. Okay, so before we jump into his poem here, and I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give you a brief breakdown of what I'm thinking after. I want you to consider what objects in your home tell the most about your life and cultural heritage. If I was over at my parents', I would have things like the Ten Commandments on the wall. Some Italian families have the Italian cherry pepper, which I know my dad had at one point. He used to wear it on a chain. I'm really tempted to say that our pantry is stocked with spaghetti. But since I am not living at home, I don't have too much cultural heritage surrounding me. But these are objects in my apartment that I think kind of reflect who I am. So I have my balancing rocks, which indicate that that's probably an area where I work hard and don't always succeed. I have my Tibetan prayer flags. I have my precious moment teacher. Little tchotchke, and then I have also this little statue that was given to me by someone that this still means a lot to me. It says little things mean a lot. So enough about me. I want you to think about some of the objects in your own home that reflect your culture and your heritage. And then moving forward, as we read this poem, I want you to think about the objects that tell us about this poet's cultural heritage, okay, and why those things are so important to him. And so without further ado, let's jump into the poem. So you'll notice it is very short. It is only a passage from the poem. And I'm gonna begin. First, I'm going to do a cold read as I explained earlier. So, and we shall be steeped, my dear, in the presence of Africa, furniture from Guinea and Congo, heavy and polished, somber and serene. On the walls, pure primordial masks, distant and yet present, stools of honor for hereditary guests, for the princes of the highlands. Wild perfumes, thick mats of silence, cushions of shade and leisure, the noise of a wellspring of peace, classic words. In a distance, antiphonal singing like Sudanese cloths, and then, friendly lamp, your kindness to soothe this obsessive presence with white, black, and red, oh, red as the African soil. So, okay, we're going to kind of go back and talk about some things here. The very opening of this passage, this poem, the speaker says that we should be steeped in the presence of Africa. When I think of the word steeped, I think of my tea bag floating in my tea, right? So that the water just absolutely absorbs the tea from the tea bag. And that is ultimately what this speaker is suggesting here at the start. He wants to be filled with the presence of Africa. And he might not be in Africa, but what is surrounding him makes him feel like he is. And he goes on to list the things that are around him. Furniture from Guinea and Congo, heavy and polished, somber and serene. So he's describing this furniture here, which is heavy and I could picture, I don't know if you can in your mind, but like a very a large piece of maybe hand cut furniture. So not like IKEA furniture. We're talking really, really beautiful, polished furniture. And he describes it as somber and serene. Somber meaning like kind of tranquil and almost sad, not sad, but almost sad, and serene. So these things seem to contradict each other, right? They are arguably, I think, opposites, right? So that's going to be of interest. I'm going to ask you about that in your assessment. On the walls, pure primordial masks, primordial meaning primitive, right? So he has these primitive masks that are described once again using paradoxes, opposites, distant and yet present. How can something be both distant and present at the same time? I want you to think about that, okay? He talks about those stools of honor for hereditary guests, which is a cultural thing. And they're meant for the princes of the highlands. Okay, we don't have princes over here in America or in French culture, I am sure. So he is talking here about African customs, wild perfumes, right? So now we're getting into your olfactory system. We're talking about scent. So these are visuals, okay? And this is something that you can smell. So he's talking about what he can smell, which maybe there's some incense burning or something that has an African scent to it, right? Thick mats of silence. So we're talking about touch here. Maybe the mat is thick and he can touch it. It's also visual, okay? Also, though, silence is an abstract noun, so that's interesting. Thick mats of silence, cushions of shade and leisure. Part of African culture, I would imagine. Okay, the noise of a wellspring of peace. Wellspring down here is a source of continual supply. So sitting on these mats in silence and shade and leisure will bring him, or I shouldn't say him, but the speaker, peace continuously. Okay, now this next part is very interesting. Classic words, right? This word classic used to modify the noun words, right? We're describing the words as classic. He is typifying African language. So African words or are always considered other, right? So I even kind of toyed with, maybe, I'm going to be honest here, skipping over this poet because he seems so deeply African, and that is exactly why I didn't want to skip him, right? So he celebrates African culture and he celebrates that to be typical and not the other. So again, these words might not be classic to us, but African words are indeed classic, and he is asserting that opinion here. In a distance, okay, so far off, antiphonal. So I wrote down here, antiphonal is an adjective that describes, okay, in a traditional Western Christian liturgy of a short sentence or its musical setting, something that is sung, recited, or played alternatively by two groups. Okay, so you have a lot of people, multiple people singing like Sudanese cloths. Okay, so we have a simile here. Obviously, singing and cloths are two opposites that are being compared. And why might that be? I think because of the cultural nature of these things. But in addition to, now we have smells, we have sights, we also have sounds, right? So lots of imagery in this poem. Imagery is, again, the five senses. So these are sensory details, okay? And he's immersing himself in this setting, okay? And I'm going to continue here. I know you're probably like, get on with it, Miss Tanella. And then friendly lamp, okay? So maybe the lamp that is in this room, okay, is casting a friendly light. Your kindness to soothe this oppressive presence. I said oppressive, I meant obsessive. Sorry, it's very late right now. Obsessive presence. So the speaker seems obsessed with everything that is around him. In fact, he's enthralled by these objects that surround him since they link him to his culture and his history. All right. White, black, and red. Oh, red as the African soil. This is somebody who is enamored with his history and his culture. And I think that that's really inspiring and profound. Those of you that come from different cultures, I think maybe can relate to what he is saying in this poem. And then there's one more slide here, okay, and then I'm going to call it quits. This is a lyric poem, okay? So poems that tell a story are narrative poems. We can think of Tropics in New York by Claude McKay. Poems that focus on personal thoughts and feelings are called lyric poems. So the word lyric refers to an ancient Greek musical instrument, the lyre, okay? Long ago, the Greeks recited poetry to the music of the lyre. So if you think about it, the Odyssey had been recited to the harp. It was like a harp or the lyre. Lyric poems can take many forms. They may follow a rhyme scheme or they may be written in free verse. All the poems we have read in this unit are lyric poems, even if they are narrative. So they do focus also on thoughts and feelings. Okay, what are the main thoughts and emotions conveyed in this poem, right? So if I were to ask you that, you might say reverence, admiration, even perhaps longing for his African roots and homeland. Okay, what vivid words or phrases contribute to the effect these thoughts and emotions have? And then I would argue maybe the heavy and polished furniture. Okay, don't only describe the furniture, right? It helps to describe his reverence and admiration. Somber, serene, honor, wellspring of peace, antiphonal singing, right? All right, guys. So I know this is a little bit of a longer one, but I thought that it would assist you and you didn't have to do it on your own. So I hope you all have a good day.